um, should be lecture 15 on the cities and the constructions of dyads in a in order to replicate the human race, a cisgender dyad of a man and woman at the beginning of their lives, at the prime position of the fertility of females, has to be enacted. But what sort of tests, stumbling blocks, rights, exercises, and potlatch did society place upon these people? What is different than the agrarian society? What has changed under first, second, third, fourth wave feminism? Other ethnicities and races with um, uh, different takes on that narrative and that rite of passage. We have the moving parts to make this intellectual watch, operate for you, to come to certain ideas of why cities form, how is it changing, give a backcasting view, and what will change cities in the future in a global society. All these parts are in motion. I just wanted to dip into a very interesting period of time at documentation right after World War II, which is seen as a just war of the rest of the world against fascism. Um, Almost never mentioning the resulting conflict between communism, Marxism, socialism to an extent, and free market economies, democracy as it's called, a neoliberal economy. Certainly after 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the walls, the state socialism was seen as a corrupt, antiquated, clunky sort of thing. What did the so-called triumph of neoliberalism do to create cities, big cities, Tokyo, Seoul, Moscow now? What really happened? What went on? So let's dip into um, American film noir, which is resulted after World War II, returning male soldiers from very vicious circumstances, a ambiguous war against fascism in Europe because many of the democratic countries were about to go fascist themselves, an interior economy made of some sort of Ponzi scheme against their citizens, but needed to focus outward to build markets. Sort of could be is neo-colonialists after the decline of the French and English empires, the carving up of the independence after colonialism of Africa, uh, Asia, and much of the other world, Latin America. What evidence do we see in film noir of a non-acceptance of the dividends of this victory? This is a document. These are films by the victors. How the boots on the ground, the dyads, really work. Let's use dyad in the sense of the cisgender Levittown house. You return from Normandy, you've survived the German machine guns, and now you get a job as the man in the gray flannel suit. Great movie. You get a tiny little Cape Cod house in Levittown. You get the obedient wife who gives you 2.5 children. You have two cars in the garage, white picket fence. We have this very artificial ideal out of agrarianism of the depression and the war of everyone grabbing an oar, and the gender roles are blended. Many of the women had worked in factories, munitions factories, arms factories, building airplanes, so forth. So they enjoyed this independence to a large measure, working in the factories. The men were over fighting a war. we had this rite of passage, and everywhere we see a non-acceptance of the dividends of winning that war, the dividends of the neoliberal economy. And we see it in this. We see the fear, pervasive fear of the Cold War. I grew up under that, and that was very pervasive. The notion that at any point the world could end in a nuclear war between two opposing ideologies, thought systems, which seemed, every time there was a war after World War II, it was validated by the domino theory. Let's turn to rite of passages. This is, and we're talking about cities as dyads, cities as bubbles, which perhaps two people create. Ancient cities were places of spectacle, places of markets, but in an evolutionary sense, cities were, certainly even places like Stonehenge, were probably places where unmarried young people could come and expand the gene pool out of their kind of localized tribes and so forth. Much of evolutionary behaviors come out of this innate desire to expand the gene pool, to expand it beyond your tribe. There's a certain cases or evidences of intermarriage within species, even Neanderthal, Homo sapiens, and almost everything else. Part of evolutionary reasons behind the walkabout in Australia is largely because of land bridges and floods. The early Homo sapiens arrived in Australia, and there was no existing hominid to which to breed with. This is another theory on evolution. So they developed the walkabout, this using the entire continent as a way of movement, moving in dream time. Did cities ultimately satisfy this function of diversifying the gene pool through dyads? In a migratory society, you say, well, no, these tribes are migrating, so conquest, violation of the females, things like that. But cities might have become willful magnets to forge these dyads of perhaps expanding the gene pool. When is it not accepted? Let's go through the top 15 best film noirs. Asphalt Jungle, I saw this years ago. Dyad between a man and a woman facing a challenge. Was the challenge of the war enough? Usually in film noir, no. It only served to cloud the picture even more. We're in trouble. The dividends do not weigh the traumas of both the Great Depression and World War II. Somehow, just as in the literature of Vietnam, which I'm a big fan of, in the accounts of the men and women who actually fought, the empty dividends, in a Jungian sense, the tests, the rites of passages of young people, both men and women, did not weigh equally to the amount of horrendous trauma that these industrial size cataclysms, such as the bombings of the world, fire bombings in Germany and Japan, the largely racial war in the Pacific, fueled by racism, the inability to parse out notions of fascism in Germany as compared to fascism in England, France, and the United States. Frankly, racism, getting people of non-European races to fight these post-colonial wars, decolonization, all these things happen. But within America, we see this barometer, we see this indicator that there's a counterculture that does not accept this. Here's another moving part, the Beatniks, great book on the road, which is reminiscent to a rite of passage walkabout of Sal Paradise and Neil, hitting the road, coming back for their women, finding women out, outside, but in general, dealing with this largely romantic, often empty version that North American continent, including Mexico as another culture, is a blank slate, an empty slate, a lonely slate. We also see this in Nomadland, the movie, which I applaud for its subtlety. A lot of people said, "Well, what kind of movie is this? It's scary, boring, and goes nowhere." I counter that. I think it goes everywhere in talking about who we are in terms of these dividends that are essentially post-colonialist. Further,